Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. This week we are going to be celebrating Chinese National Day. As of October 1st, the China will be celebrating its National Day, essentially of the declaration of the People's Republic of China after a long struggle for national liberation. So I would like to look back at sort of the legacy of the Chinese Revolution, especially as it relates to sort of the material gains of that revolution. That is to say, I want to look at actually what were the improvements in people's lives from the days of sort of colonialism to sort of that post-revolutionary era. So to talk about all this, I am very glad to be joined with Sheila Xiao with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Thank you very much, Sheila, for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Even before we get to that point of sort of the establishment of the PRC on October 1st of 1949, I think it's really important for people to understand that China suffered up until that point what is called within the national history a century of humiliation. That's what it's known as internally. That's to say a century of colonial domination, a century of exploitation by British colonialism that people don't hear much about. I would like to maybe sort of talk about what the factors that led into this Chinese War for Independence actually were.
Yeah, I'm glad that you opened up with the century of humiliation. And before I start, National Day, which is October 1st, also happens to fall on a Chinese holiday, Mid-Autumn Festival. So anyone who is celebrating, I wish you a happy Mid-Autumn Festival. But yeah, the century of humiliation, as you mentioned, is literally a period where China was taken over and looted by almost virtually every single imperialist power of that time. Just imagine China went from being one of the most advanced civilizations, another pawn for the imperialists to fight over. And so the conditions of China during that time were not only one of deep, victims of colonization, but a system, a feudal system that could no longer protect it. You have a situation where there's massive opium addiction that was really one of the reasons why China even entered this period of century of humiliation. Was it started off with the opium wars that was waged by. So yeah, there's a lot of history of just instability within the government, imperialist invasions, imperialist takeover of different parts of China, revolutions, failed reform efforts, all of that stuff that just kind of leads into what we're going to be talking about, which is the 1949 revolution that was basically a huge triumph and victory of the Communist Party. And I would say that, the struggle that led up to 1949 was twofold, right? It was not only fighting against imperialism, at this point, they're really fighting against Japanese invasion in China, but also fighting against the Nationalist Party, the Chinese Nationalist Party that was heavily backed by the U.S. government. So it was a two-pronged type of civil war. It was a civil war, but also an anti-imperialist national liberation struggle. What were some of the conditions that that China was facing during this time? By October 1st, 1949, China had suffered basically destruction of all kinds of infrastructure in a status that was beyond repair. Not only that, but there was limited modern industry, right? And any type of modern industry that did exist were foreign owned previously. 80% of the population in China worked in agriculture. Less than 10% of the population owned 70% of the land. Life expectancy in China was 35 to 40 years old. And of course, widespread illiteracy. So these are just kind of some bullet points of what we're dealing with, right? China is now coming out of a deep state of underdevelopment in 1949. So what comes after October 1st, 1949 is really just tackling these, how do we, on the one hand, develop China to catch up to the rest of the world? How do we develop China in a way where we can actually feed and meet the needs of the people, but also remain in a socialist tradition and continue the path towards socialism?
Thank you so much for that setup, and that's absolutely such an important point to talk about. Is this a dual these two tasks really of sort of the Chinese Revolution? On the one hand, trying to reverse or otherwise correct in some way the kind of underdevelopment, the purposeful underdevelopment that colonialism left China, where, as you said, the life expectancy was 35 years, where most people were in an agricultural society, and where what industry had existed for sure was often kind of destroyed during these kind of brutal wars, because as we kind of know, like these sort of capitalist regimes do not give up anything willingly. They're willing to destroy kind of everything to prevent essentially them from falling from power. Like this is how colonialism functions in this way. And so yeah, this really, I think, is such an important question for sort of this early Chinese government of like, how do we on the one hand tackle this massive widespread poverty and illiteracy? Like, how do we actually develop the standard of living for the country? But then how do we also do so, I think, in an equitable way, in a socialist way, in a way that kind of brings about the, I would say, to use a liberalish term, like the democratic ideals that I think socialism entails, of people being in charge of their workplace, of people being in charge of, the means of production. And so I'm wondering sort of what the trends started to develop there as far as like how to tackle some of these problems. What were some of the major, first priorities of sort of the Chinese Communist Party?
That is a great question. And there's in terms of the scope of what the Communist Party prioritized in the beginning of the revolution is just so kind of vast. But I think the first thing that I'd like to mention is the marriage laws, right? The marriage law that basically prohibits the superiority of man over woman, right? To abolish bigamy, concubinage, child marriage, all of these kind of old school feudal laws around marriage and women's oppression are now eliminated. I think that that's a really huge, I think that's something that folks kind of who want to learn about China should understand, that when you're fighting against imperialism and feudalism, this is the women's question is very, very important. And so the Chinese Communist Party definitely recognized that. Immediately after the revolution, the Communist Party focused on redistributing land. So land reforms took place. I have a statistic here that 300 million peasants really benefited from this redistribution. They started to build the foundation for what we will see to be as cooperatives. They started to restore the existing infrastructure that was destroyed during the warfare. And yeah, at this time, China also focused, this was just immediately after the 1949 revolution, focusing their relationship with the Soviet Union and having trade relationships with them. Of course, history, as people know, there was a split that happens that's called the Sino-Soviet split, which we could do a whole podcast on just the complexities of that. But I would say that first period of just friendship, this friendship alliance with the Soviet Union really helped jumpstart the redevelopment of China. And just to go back on the women's question too, like in addition to the marriage law, women were highly encouraged to join the workforce, right? During the Great Leap Forward period, all kinds of communal kitchens, kindergartens, nurseries were formed so that women could participate in these development projects. And at this period, close to 5 million nurseries and kindergartens were created. More than 36 million dining halls were set up in rural areas by 1959. Of course, massive literacy campaigns were carried out, which was a huge undertaking because, as I mentioned earlier, there was massive illiteracy. But just within 10 years of instituting an educational policy, China's illiteracy rates went from 80% to 43%, even in rural areas. So this meant that the Communist Party took very seriously the prioritization of educating hundreds of millions of people how to read and write.
It's such impressive on the face of it, I think, like just sort of listening to these facts, listening to sort of the reality that so much of sort of life was improved, that quality of life was improved in these very meaningful ways. But I think some people like sort of, might have the sense to like lose the statistics from sort of the greater picture, or like, they kind of say that like statistics don't really tell the narrative or whatnot. And I sort of want to compare this just very briefly, thinking of what's going on in China in the 40s and 50s, and just compare that to a second in terms of like what we consider to be progressive, what we consider to be large step forwards for humankind. Compare this to, I don't know, what the US was doing in the 40s and 50s. Compare this to compare like something like a massive Chinese government sponsored literacy campaign, cuts the illiteracy rate in China in half. And compare this, I think, to something like what the U.S. was doing, which was essentially like preventing, essentially like black people in particular, but preventing like sort of its own sort of internal colonized nations from being able to access this literacy. Like the kind of, there was no major push at any point. There was no national major push, at least not from the U.S. government in this respect, to sort of solve all these problems, but actually it seemed to exacerbate these problems. And so like understanding, I think that like these major pushes, I think, for progressive steps forward so often originated from these socialist countries where it was no longer sort of the people fighting the government. I mean, at least not to the same degree. It was no longer like sort of the people fighting the government to have these basic rights, but it was actually initiatives very often by the government, like to expand this. Like it was sort of this willingness of the Chinese government to tackle these things as actual societal problems and to say like illiteracy is unacceptable, chauvinism is unacceptable, sexism is unacceptable, and then to like sort of root that out in society. And to offer people better alternatives and whatnot. I don't know. I think it establishes such a better precedent than I think anything that the U.S. was doing, or anything that most of the rest of the world was doing at this time. I don't know how you feel about that.
I mean, I agree. And just if you look at the priorities of the Chinese government, and of course, there's a lot to say about the changes between the early periods of the revolution to the current period of the revolution, which is, another whole can of worms. But I think that just understanding that the priority of the Communist Party throughout the entire stretch since 1949 until today is how do we develop China? How do we take on this development of China? And how do we meet the needs of the people? We're talking about, the largest population of any country in the, in the world. And so these are things that the Chinese government has prioritized is how do we meet the people's needs? And, we can't say that that's really the priority here in the United States. I think case in point, we're currently in a global pandemic, and we're dealing with massive unemployment rates. We're dealing with elections next month that give us really, really terrible options and which either none of them have even really talked really about addressing these massive issues of unemployment, this housing crisis, this crisis of the burden placed on educators now. All of these things are not even on the table to be discussed. So I think it's really important that you point out these contradictions, because I think, when you compare the priorities of the US government to the Chinese government, well, only one of the two has lifted 800 million people out of poverty within a very short amount of time, and that's China. Their goal of eliminating poverty and meeting the needs of their people, you can see it today in terms of the rise in life expectancy, the rise in standard of living, the millions of people lifted out of poverty, and I think that as much as there is a lot of misperception about China, just look at those numbers, look at those facts when we talk about comparing the US to China, because poverty just continues to grow here in the United States. Our education system, like, just think about, earlier I talked about how these communes were set up such that women could be brought into the workplace. So in order to do that, dining halls, communal dining halls, educational facilities, nurseries, kindergartens, these were all created so that people can go to work and not have to worry about their household duties, the same way that we have to do in US society, right? The burden of the second shift, or just the burden of what is traditionally known as women's work, is lifted off of their shoulders such that they can participate in the workforce. In the US, we're in a situation where everyone now has to work from home if they're able to do it. And if you have a child, then you are probably spending half of your time working and then half of your time taking care of your child without any relief to say, okay, if you have a child at home, then you should be exempt from working right now, because obviously we can't have massive amounts of children in daycare facilities. There's really no solution brought forward to mitigate the additional stress pandemic. Even during normal circumstances, these options are not available to people. So I'm really happy that you brought up this comparison. There's so much to say when we talk about comparing the US to China in terms of the priorities. Just to kind of wrap up this point here, like, we can see very clearly that the priorities of the government isn't to meet the needs of the people here. If that were the case, we wouldn't be suffering, hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths and reaching record numbers every single day.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are talking with Sheila Xiao of the Party for Socialism and Liberation about the kind of legacy of the Chinese Revolution as China celebrates their National Day on October 1st. I'd just like to kind of hammer one more point home about like this kind of response between sort of, the way the U.S. handles business versus the way China handles business, and that's sort of the role of the state in tackling something like this. They were being criticized at the time essentially for being so quote unquote authoritarian, that this lockdown was authoritarian. And now here we are, essentially because China acted so swiftly and decisively, China is now largely able at this point to reopen its society again, quote unquote reopen. Like, China essentially is able to function normally. They're able to have sort of the parties, they're able to have large music concerts and whatnot. So their society is no longer on a lockdown. Whereas within the U.S., because this was not ever made, because the U.S. relies on its like sort of need to constantly be exploiting labor, and refuses to make any concessions to workers whatsoever. There's been this sort of like kind of half lockdown that's kept everyone in peril for essentially the entirety of 2020 at this point. And we're unable to really safely reopen at any point. We're actually, again, the epicenter of all this, the global epicenter of the pandemic. And so, like, when you talk about something abstract like authoritarianism, when you talk about like something, being an authoritarian move to shut down society, well, ultimately, like China in many ways was able to not only keep people safer through this, have so many fewer deaths, even though essentially like the coronavirus it may or may not have originated there, but it certainly like the Wuhan was where it first sort of came to world prominence. But yeah, essentially China was able to sort of successfully deal with this problem, where the U.S. is just continually sort of bleeding from this problem. Because there's no sort of centralization, there's no sort of coordination, and more than anything, there's no sort of there's no sort of willpower on behalf of anyone within the government to do anything to sort of like solve these problems for the people. And then sort of the other thing, like I heard anecdotally, as far as circling back to that point, that like sort of Chinese police were essentially like, you could call the police and they would deliver groceries to your door during the height of the pandemic, when it was at its height. That's not something that you could ever do here. You can't call the police here and have a cop just deliver groceries to your door. They're more likely to just kind of shoot you on the spot or whatnot. It's absolute, like, this horrifying police state or whatnot. China also has used its military in sort of similar sort of green economic projects and whatnot to sort of reforest certain areas, so that China essentially understanding like, oh, we have this body sort of, we have this body of people sort of sitting idle. Why don't we have them do something constructive for the world? Whereas, like, what does the U.S. military do for the world? They invade, they destroy, and they destabilize. And so, yeah, that sort of difference in like how the state gets utilized is also important. I'd also like to turn though to also the more like international part of this. That China essentially, like going back to sort of this revolutionary point of the 40s into the 50s, even from the very beginning, China had a very consistent international role. And that role has always essentially been, I think, in response to their own century of humiliation, to say that because they were so brutalized by British colonialism, that they now sort of take this this sort of stance toward international development, where essentially they believe very much in charting an independent course. That is to say, across the world, when China enters into sort of trade agreements, when China enters into, even early on, like the Korean War, like China's goal with international relations always seems to be this sort of development along independent lines. As to say, they're less concerned, to some degree, they've seemed less concerned with sort of the purity, the political purity of a particular government, and simply concerned with sort of the belief that countries should have this ability to develop independently of U.S. imperialism. I wonder how, if you can talk a little bit about how this precedent was sort of established in these early years, or maybe I'm sort of misrepresenting any points, if you'd like to push back on any of that as well.
Yeah, I would say in the beginning years of the Chinese Revolution, of course, international solidarity was something that I think was a huge part of China's policy. I will say that, of course, it hasn't always been that way, and this mainly has to do with a period in which China felt that it needed to take on a policy of appeasement to the United States. In order for China to develop, it needs to basically keep the US government away from attacking China. So, of course, we see this throughout the end of the 80s, 90s, and even maybe up until maybe no more than 5 or so years ago, where China, even though it had a history and legacy of international solidarity, it wasn't always the case in the course of the 70 years. Of course, we go back to the Sino-Soviet split, which of course has its own history and a lot of depth and nuances that requires its own explanation. But where China, after the years of the beginning years of the revolution, didn't always take the most principled position in the eyes of leftists. And I think we should be honest about that as well. And so, of course, now that China has sort of emerged as a major power, a lot of the misconceptions that people have about China and their trade relationships with other countries is they try to compare it to US imperialism. Oh, it's two major imperialist powers that are fighting with each other. And that's just incorrect. That's actually a very false comparison. It's like you're comparing apples and oranges. Of course, the Chinese government has tons of trade agreements with many other developing nations. I think one that that a lot of folks point to in the myth of Chinese imperialism is that China is colonizing African nations, and this is untrue, and the thing that I'll say about this is that China does not dictate the political policies of any of these nations that it does business with. This is fundamentally different from colonialism and U.S. colonialism, where they go into these lands, they take over these lands, they exploit the people, exploit the resources, and then underdevelop them. What China is doing with these other countries is one of mutual benefit, and it's not to say that China is doing this purely based on an international solidarity standpoint. Of course, there are capitalist interests that play into these types of developments with these other nations. Of course, a lot of Chinese companies stand to benefit from it, but they're not the ones that are dictating these agreements. It's not like China is holding a gun to the heads of these nations. So I think it's really important when people talk about imperialism and colonialism is to define what that actually means. It's not China that has over 800 bases around the world policing other countries and making sure that they're retaining the interests of the Chinese government. That's the United States. So in terms of scope, I think it's really, really important to contextualize just like how, well, one, the comparison of the US to China in respect to this kind of loose definition of imperialism is false, but also just the scope of the military. To kind of wrap up this point too, I appreciated, Brianna, you bringing up the point about reforestation. China just pledged to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, which is hugely ambitious, such an ambitious plan to chart forward. And if China is successful, China will be the global leader that's going to be combating climate change. And this is the impending crisis of our generation. This is the thing that's on everyone's mind. Not only the pandemic, not only the national uprisings that we've been seeing against police brutality, but we also have this climate catastrophe that's looming over our heads, and the U.S. government, including the U.S. military, which is the number one polluter in the world, is not taking this issue seriously because it's against the interests of the ruling class. It's against the interests of the corporate class. It's not profitable to be thinking about the environment, to be thinking about sustainability. And so I think with China gaining global prominence and credibility among other third world nations, among other nations in the world, on top of them being the second largest economy, on top of them possibly becoming the leader of combating climate change, the United States is scared. They do not want a major power like China to be their rival. So when we hear about all this propaganda about China and authoritarianism and all these many different demonizing headlines that we see against China, it's really to create a culture of anti-Chinese racism, anti-China rhetoric, because the US government and corporate media benefits from the people handing over consent for there to be heightened aggression with China. that's really why we see a lot of this anti-China rhetoric in the media and so on and so forth.
There have been. I mean, there's also a sort of a long sort of tradition of Marxist theory in kind of regard to like multipolarity and whatnot, that essentially has shown, and we can sort of look at the historical precedents here, that, you know, really organizing for kind of social and economic justice, and especially organizing for like a revolutionary moment, that is to say, those people who truly believe that society can be changed and should be changed for the better. Well, these kind of revolutionary moments, they require they require there to be sort of an unacceptable crisis within sort of society, within the status quo. And that to some degree has to happen when sort of the global empire, such as the US, finally hits a stalling point. That is to say that as long as the US is able to run the world efficiently and in a unipolar manner, it makes essentially our job here within the US, it makes the job of those who really, really care about sort of ushering in a better system, it makes our job so much more difficult. And yet here we are at sort of, I think, this essentially point where the US empire is stalling out to some degree in its ability to control world events. And certainly all of the countries that the US is sort of stalled out on have their own contradictions, whether that's China, whether that's Russia or Iran or Venezuela or the many others who are charting this sort of independent path. But from kind of my perspective, like, it's absolutely necessary for there to be a multipolar world if we want to, you know, sort of have an alternative system to look toward, whatever the contradictions within those systems, to have alternative systems to look toward. And then I think another part of that for me is also with regard to China in particular, is China has a commitment that few other countries in the world have to actual carbon neutrality. And unlike, the Western capitalist countries, they actually have kind of the willpower, they've demonstrated the willpower to actually do this by quickly becoming the world's leader in green energy. And so, you know, to me, like, sometimes I feel a little dramatic saying this, but I feel like sort of the survival of the planet to some degree, or the survival of like a sustainable environment, relies on the survival in this particular moment of China. If China were to, if absolute catastrophe were to strike and somehow the U.S. were able to overthrow China, then I feel in many ways that would be sort of the death knell for, you know, essentially the environmentalist movement, because capitalism has no, capitalism has no response to global warming. And so, you know, I think, like, to me, from my perspective, it's always important to understand that, like, that international context, and to say that, like, our problems are not China, our problems are not really Russia or Iran or Venezuela, that the problems with the environment, the problems with police brutality, the problems with coronavirus, those are all things right here on our home front that we need to tackle on, you know, again, the quote unquote home front here. Am I being a little too dramatic there, or is that, does that point kind of resonate with you?
I mean, that point resonates with me even just beyond the climate change issue. You know, we're talking about what would happen if China were to be successfully dismantled and overthrown by the U.S. government, which is their number one dream. That's the dream of the U.S. government, is to destabilize China. Not only would we lose a major power, major force that is putting forward a plan for climate change, something that not many other countries are doing. Maybe some of the more, some of the European countries have a plan like that, but when we're talking about a major power, you know, the United States has not put forward a plan. And in fact, they're still debating if climate change is real. If the US is successful in dismantling and overthrowing the Chinese government, it's gonna have its blowbacks on all of us, right? We're talking about all the people who had been lifted out of poverty in China will be thrown back into poverty, you know? We're talking about all of the gains of the revolution will be reversed for those in China. We're talking about all the countries that now rely on China for trade are now going to be dictated once again by this unilateral power of the United States, right? And we know how predatory the the policies of trade are with the United States. There are many other nations that would much rather do business with China just on the basis of not being bossed around, not having their policies bossed around by the United States. Beyond the climate change question, like, what would war with China look like? It would be a global catastrophe. It would be devastating, not just for the Chinese people, but for the American people. I mean, how long have we been in perpetual warfare? I mean, my entire life, for most of my life, our country, the United States, has waged war, has waged terror and destruction on all of the Middle East, on trying to overthrow governments all over the world, including Venezuela, which we've seen in the recent years. And so it's just like, this has done nothing but cause instability across the world in the name of just maintaining US hegemony. And so we have already seen the history of what it's like when the United States goes into your country and dictates your policies, right? It's never one that is going to benefit the people. The one that I like to cite is when the Obama administration went human rights, right, in the name of overthrowing an authoritarian leader. Well, Libya is now a modern slave market. It went from being one of the only countries, or I guess the country with the highest standard of living in Africa, to being a modern slave market. And I think the Chinese government is very much aware of what the consequences are if they're not fighting hard to defend itself, to deflect any type of confrontation with China. I mean, from the United States, it really does not want to ruffle any feathers with the US government. And that's why during the 90s and early 2000s, it took on this appeasement policy of like, let's just be friendly with the United States so that we can quietly develop, so we could quietly focus on our goals and our needs. And so the ramifications of this new US Cold War against China has catastrophic implications beyond the need to address the climate issue, so those are kind of my thoughts around this, and absolutely, like, this is why I'm glad that we're on here talking about this and having a conversation about China, because what we really need is peace and collaboration with China, not further aggression and war with China. And I think that for anyone listening, if you're wondering, well, how come every single media headline I've read about China all has to do with all of the egregious thing that the Chinese government is doing, like, just think to yourself, what is the purpose of this type of media, and what is the narrative that's being fed to me? And I ask you all to question it and to look more into some of these issues.
Yeah, without a doubt. So in our last minute or two, is there anything else that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you feel merits mentioning?
I think understanding the history of China and where it came from in regard to the century of humiliation, what China had to endure during those 100+ years, and why it is such a celebration to have this revolution enter its 71st year. It's not that the people in China are well-studied, read, Marxists, socialists, any of that. It's not even because of that that's keeping China cohesive. It's really because the Chinese people remember this history. They remember the history of deep, massive colonization, of just being looted by all of these imperialist governments, and the memory of the Japanese War in China is one that's really deeply painful for a lot of Chinese people. In fact, one of my dad's favorite dramas that he likes to watch is one of the Japanese War in the 30s. And so it's something that is etched deep into the hearts of Chinese people. And so the Chinese people, you know, they defend their government because they defend their sovereignty. They defend their independence from Western imperialism. So I think for, you know, all peace-loving people, all people who are pro, you know, human rights, who are progressive, like, just think about what it means to just let China develop the way that it wants to develop without any interference from the US government or any other Western nation. And with that being said, like, if you are pro, like, you know, the independence and sovereignty of China, of any nation, then we really do need to oppose this rampant aggression against China that we're seeing from the US government, from Mike Pompeo, from the corporate ruling class.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up. We have been talking today about Chinese National Day, the celebration of the 71st anniversary of the Chinese Revolution and the Declaration of the People's Republic of China. We have been joined for this segment by Sheila Xiao of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Thank you very much, Sheila, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. I just want to mention that People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. And so for our second segment, which is going to be a little bit shorter, I'm going to get into debate coverage a little bit. I'm actually outsourcing this. I just want to say to anyone who is forced to cover the debate for their show, I hope you are into some serious self-care. I hope you're taking care of yourself and whatnot. And I just want to also give a shout out to Eugene Puryear and the good crew at Breakthrough News. I'm actually going to sort of outsource their coverage to their post debate coverage. It's just a little bit late in the kind of recording cycle of this show for me to have recorded my own segment. And I don't, I've seen it now. I don't have any thoughts that I feel are even worth sharing on it. It was awful. The debate was just pure spectacle. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and outsource this. This is Eugene Puryear, with also co-host and guest of Breakthrough News. You can find Breakthrough News across social media and on YouTube for true independent journalism on the ground and about geopolitical events, all the same. So yeah, hopefully you get a chance to check out Breakthrough News after this segment. And I will catch you next week with hopefully a full episode of People's Republic. And huge thanks to the crew at Breakthrough News for allowing me to rebroadcast some of this material.
There's so many ways we could probably start here. There's a lot to be said. We'll try to get in as much as possible. I think for me, and before we go to the guest, just some top lines, maybe the major issue and the major takeaway for me is, despite the fact that we are facing global crises of humanity on a range of different issues, there's actually multiple crises of humanity, we didn't actually hear that much of substance about them. There was a lot of mudslinging, a lot of name calling, a lot of back and forth, very little substance in terms of what will be done. And even many of the things that were stated in terms of what would be done, except for maybe perhaps some of Trump's lies about what he would accomplish, what was stated about what the politicians would do are not solutions that will really meet the scale of these problems, will really meet the challenges that are not only facing the United States, but facing the world. And I think just right on its face right there, Monica, that is I don't know if it's the biggest letdown, because this is maybe par for the course with what we've seen from the political discourse in this campaign, but it certainly seems like a complete and total abdication of responsibility by two people claiming that they want to be the leader of the United States and, in their words, the leader of the world. So, I mean, it's hard to even know exactly where to start here. I would say that without any doubt at all, if you were watching this, certainly as a foreign leader in any foreign country, you have to be saying, let's all plan for American decline right away, because there's no way that either of these two people are going to address these challenges or get the thing back on track.
I think that's exactly right, Eugene. I mean, I haven't said this since my high school civics class, but as an American citizen, I am mortified watching this debate, seeing two candidates that 50% of Americans don't believe are mentally fit to even hold the seat in the White House. I mean, it's just really horrifying. And it's just really, I think what's most telling about this entire election, and even so much of the commentary that we're hearing from the liberal and the conservative media establishment, the fact that each candidate's main selling point is that they're not the other guy, to me signals a huge problem, a huge crisis in what we call the greatest democracy in the world. So I'll keep it at that to get right to our guest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and we've got a couple guests coming up here. First, we want to bring in Henry Williams, the executive director of the Gravel Institute. Henry, really appreciate you joining us here on Breakthrough News this evening.
Hi, glad to be here.
You know, just maybe to start off, maybe just give me your top line thoughts about what we saw here tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing you have to keep in mind from the beginning is that Trump has gone so far to the right and taken the landscape of this election so far to the right that what we're seeing again and again in this debate is they're competing who can be further right, who can punch the left harder, who can say more that they don't want to do a Green New Deal, who can praise cops more. I mean, in reality, what you're seeing between the two of them is they live in this kind of hyper reality where rather than addressing the real and present crises in front of people's eyes, right now, what we're hearing about instead are these, manufactured media crises on both sides for both of them. And I think worse than that is that neither of them really seem to express the kind of deep and necessary humanity that is so needed at a moment like this.
Yeah, no, I think that's an extraordinarily good point. I think the point about humanity is maybe the key point. I mean, it certainly seems that this is a time with hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of people with the coronavirus, that there'd be some human empathy. But it really seemed on the COVID-19 crisis, Henry, that it was really just about who could get one-upsmanship. And that almost felt like the entire debate. And I wonder if, from your perspective, that's maybe not a mistake. I mean, that the TV networks and all of that, to some degree, this kind of WWE style of debate is maybe what they are looking for.
Right. I want to say off the bat, I think Chris Wallace is probably one of the worst moderators in the history of presidential debates. And I think he should honestly be ashamed of himself for his performance tonight. We've been seeing Trump's antics now for 5 years on the national political stage, and yet Chris Wallace and the networks that covered this debate were unwilling to do anything to address all the techniques that Trump has used since day one of the primaries. They didn't turn his mic off. They didn't turn Biden's mic off. They didn't actually stop or interrupt either of them when they took it off topic, when they took it to personal attacks, and they didn't follow up with facts when they lied. At the end of the day, they're just not willing to do that because they know that this makes good TV either way, regardless of what the truth is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the point couldn't really be made well. I mean, I was actually, as you were talking, trying to remember in my own mind all of the moderators and who maybe had been worse. I haven't come up with one yet, so I'm going to give you Chris Wallace on that right now. I mean, it even seemed to me at times that he was trying to maybe even help Biden by kind of cutting him off when he was rambling. And I don't know, maybe you could argue that's better for the quality of the debate, but it did seem at times that Chris Wallace's obvious exasperation with Trump. I mean, whatever we feel about Trump, this itself will become a talking point that, at least in my view, could help Trump starting tomorrow, because all of his surrogates will be saying Biden had an earpiece and he wouldn't check. He didn't have a drug test. Chris Wallace was on his side. And I just wonder, from your perspective, is, for Trump, is it positive or negative, no matter what people are saying about him, that all the coverage is on him?
Yeah, I mean, this is the technique that Trump has employed since he entered our sort of national consciousness. He understands, so long as he controls the narrative, whatever that narrative is, he can spin it to his advantage. I think that's what he and his team thought about tonight's debate. They said, speak as much as you possibly can, get as many attacks as you can in. And I think that, the unwillingness of Chris Wallace to really step into the debate, or more importantly, the unwillingness of him to ensure that it followed a trajectory grounded in reality, grounded in the actual crises facing our country, means that what we actually got was, again, the Trump show as we usually get it in its usual form. But worse than that, I think what we got is the sort of unmitigated slew of just a hodgepodge of what's been in the headlines the last few weeks. What I would have really liked to have heard out of this debate is, let's present both candidates with the facts. 8 million people unemployed, 200,000 people dead of the coronavirus, and more importantly than that, Congress having not passed a single bill to aid the American people since March. That topic didn't even come up once at this entire debate, and yet there are literally 8 million people living hand to mouth. There are people under threat of homelessness and starvation, and we did not hear about them once tonight, but instead we managed to get a full 5 minutes about Trump and the size of his rallies relative to those of Biden. I mean, that is an unconscionable moral sin, and I think, honestly, everyone involved with the production of this debate should be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. A couple of issues I want to bring out. I mean, in terms of other issues that were left out, I think an important issue, and again, you are the executive director of the Gravel Institute, and one of the major issues that when Mike Gravel was in the Democratic primary, he raised that he really wanted to bring to the forefront was foreign policy, issues surrounding U.S. imperialism. I mean, China was mentioned kind of tangentially, but maybe I missed it, but it seems foreign policy issues and America's role in the world, by and large, nothing, crickets.
Yeah, I think one thing you have to keep in mind here is that neither side is really willing to lean on foreign policy as an issue. I think that Biden is a little embarrassed about his record, not just on China, but the number of times that his viewpoint, and you have to remember, Biden's been in public life since Mike Gravel. They actually won in the same election year, and Mike Gravel is now 90 years old, so that definitely gives you some perspective on how long Joe Biden has been in politics. The decisions that he's made in that time, those decisions on China, the decisions on foreign policy, are not the kind of thing that he wants to come up and defend. And that's why he'll skirt the topic. And when it comes to Trump, I don't think he has ever had a really coherent view or strategy. You hear him bash China today and talk about his ban on China. Listen to what he was saying about China and their coronavirus response in January, what he was saying every time that he spoke to Xi in the 3 years before that. Ultimately, the story that you get here is on both sides really a lack of a coherent theory or strategy of America's presence in the world. And I think you can trace this all the way back to 2001, since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and since the real collapse of a neoconservative, let's police the world viewpoint, because of the tremendous failure of the war on terror since then, neither side has really come up with a new consensus or a new approach to the world since then. And all that they can do is try to dodge the subject and hope that Americans don't care. And the tragic reality is that when it's not in headlines, when it's not something that we talk about, Americans often seem content to forget about the fate of the rest of the world.
I think that's 100% true. I think it's one of the most interesting elements of sort of U.S. politics, certainly about lesser of two evil politics, is the contradiction about, well, what's better for who? And it's never talked about what's better for those who are being murdered by drone strikes. I mean, one other issue that I really want your thoughts on here, obviously Trump, I think this was widely expected, trying to drive a wedge into at least the prospective Democratic coalition, making the point, that Joe Biden wasn't, well, really trying to expose the fact that there is difference between Biden and Bernie Sanders. A few interesting things here. At the end, Biden noting that his climate jobs might not necessarily be a $15 an hour minimum wage, despite the fact he's running on that. I mean, to some degree, I don't know how people take this because it's coming from Trump, but do you think at all, Henry, that the slight exposure here, it wasn't a major issue of the debate, of Biden saying directly that he is against many of the things that the base of people who he needs to support him want, is ultimately going to hurt him, or have, those who are looking at this maybe already made up their minds?
Yeah, what I want to really focus on here is this question of the huge problems facing this country and our world today. The reality is that median wages in America and in the developed world in general have stagnated since the 1970s. The reality is that we had a jobless recovery since 2008. We've been in a state of stagnation or outright collapse in nearly every sector of American society since 2008, really. And I think the recovery has been really not meaningful to the average person. And yet, despite that, people like Biden continually see, when they're faced with someone like Trump, who will fearmonger about the left, who will bring up the idea of these plans being radical or one of these things.
All right, those are the good folks at Breakthrough News with their post-presidential debate coverage on Tuesday night. I did not get a chance to record my own segment about this issue, but I really appreciate their coverage of it. I really appreciate all of the wonderful journalism over at Breakthrough News. So I hope some of you will, if you're not already familiar with this kind of relatively new outlet, I hope you get a chance to check it out sometime. It's on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, wherever your social media is. It's all there. So I will catch you next week. Hope you all survived that debate, and we'll have plenty more coverage coming up for you starting next week. So yeah,
that's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.